My name is Hannah Reyes. I'm 26 years old. 3 days after I moved out of the apartment I'd shared with my roommate Ashley for 2 years, our landlord emailed me to say my portion of our security deposit, $1,100, was being withheld entirely, due to what Ashley had described, in writing, as significant damage I'd caused throughout our tenancy. Scuffed floors. A cracked bathroom tile. Stains on the carpet in my old bedroom that Ashley claimed I'd never bothered to clean. I hadn't caused any of it. Most of that damage, as far as I could tell, hadn't even existed when I'd actually lived there. What Ashley didn't know was that on the exact day I'd moved in, 2 years earlier, I'd walked through the entire apartment with my phone, photographing every wall, every floor, every fixture, specifically because a friend had warned me to always document a move-in before signing anything. Those photos were still sitting in my cloud storage, timestamped, untouched, showing an apartment in considerably better condition than the one Ashley was now describing to our landlord. Her silent revenge stories. If you've ever been blamed for something you never did, right as you were finally getting free of it, comment "not this time" below. This one's for you. Ashley and I met through a mutual friend roughly 6 months before we became roommates, a connection that had felt, at the time, genuinely promising. We shared similar taste in furniture, similar schedules, and what seemed, in those early conversations, like a compatible approach to shared living. I want to describe our early months as roommates honestly, because I think the gradual deterioration of our relationship matters to understanding how absurd her eventual accusation would turn out to be. Our first year together had been, by most measures, genuinely fine, not an especially close friendship, but a functional, respectful roommate relationship built on reasonably clear communication and mutual consideration for shared spaces. Things had shifted, gradually, over our second year, in ways I hadn't fully named at the time but understood, in retrospect, as the slow accumulation of small tensions that eventually calcified into something considerably more adversarial by the time our lease ended. I want to describe the specific circumstances of our move-in, 2 years before this story's central events, because the details of that day became directly relevant to everything that eventually unfolded. Ashley and I had signed our lease together, splitting the security deposit evenly, moving into a modest 2-bedroom apartment that, while not luxurious, was in genuinely good condition when we first walked through it, freshly painted walls, clean carpets, appliances that all functioned properly. I'd learned, from a friend who'd gone through a difficult deposit dispute of her own the previous year, that documenting a move-in thoroughly was essential protection against exactly this kind of dispute later on. Following her advice, I spent nearly 45 minutes on move-in day walking through every room with my phone, photographing walls, floors, fixtures, and appliances from multiple angles, making sure each photo's metadata would clearly show the actual date. I mentioned this practice to Ashley at the time, even suggesting she do the same for her own protection. She'd laughed it off, telling me I was being overly cautious, and hadn't bothered taking any photos of her own. I want to describe our first year of living together, because I think establishing this baseline matters to understanding how the relationship eventually deteriorated. Ashley and I maintained a genuinely functional roommate dynamic throughout that first year, splitting chores reasonably, respecting each other's space, occasionally socializing together but generally maintaining separate social lives without any particular friction. I don't want to overstate the closeness of our relationship, but I also don't want to understate how genuinely unremarkable and cooperative it was during this period. I kept our shared spaces reasonably clean, following the same standards I'd maintained in every living situation throughout my adult life. I never caused any damage to the apartment that I was aware of, beyond the ordinary, expected where that comes with daily living, nothing beyond what any reasonable landlord would anticipate and account for when assessing a security deposit. I want to describe how our relationship began shifting, roughly a year into our 2-year lease, because understanding this shift matters to understanding Ashley's eventual motivations for the accusation she'd make once we finally moved out. Ashley began dating someone seriously around this time, a relationship that occupied increasingly significant portions of her attention and, eventually, her physical presence in our apartment. Her boyfriend, Tyler, began staying over with increasing frequency, eventually amounting to what felt, from my perspective, like an unofficial third roommate who wasn't contributing to rent or utilities. I raised this concern with Ashley directly, gently at first, then more pointedly as the pattern continued without any acknowledgement or adjustment on her part. These conversations, I want to be honest, introduced a specific tension into our relationship that hadn't existed during our more harmonious first year. Ashley became increasingly defensive whenever I raised the topic, framing my reasonable concerns as unreasonable restrictiveness on my part. I want to describe how this tension continued escalating over the following months, because I think the specific texture of that escalation matters to understanding the emotional context surrounding Ashley's eventual accusation. Beyond the Tyler situation, Ashley and I began experiencing friction over other shared living issues, disagreements about cleaning schedules, about grocery contributions, about the general division of household responsibilities that had, in our first year, felt genuinely balanced but increasingly, in our second year, felt lopsided in ways that generated real resentment on both sides. I want to be honest that I wasn't a perfect roommate during this period either. My own patience wore thin more than once, and I know I occasionally responded to Ashley's frustrations with less grace than I might have managed during our easier first year. But I never, at any point, caused deliberate or careless damage to our shared living space, regardless of how strained our interpersonal relationship had become. I want to describe the circumstances leading to my decision to move out, since I think understanding my own motivations matters to countering any suggestion that I left under circumstances that might explain or justify Ashley's later accusations. Our lease was approaching its natural 2-year end when I decided, independently, that I wanted to find my own apartment, a decision driven by a desire for more independence and by the accumulated, unresolved tension that had developed with Ashley over the preceding year, rather than any specific, dramatic falling out that might explain retaliatory behavior on her part. I informed Ashley of this decision several months in advance, giving her ample time to find a new roommate or make her own arrangements for the apartment going forward. Our conversations about the logistics of my move-out were, I want to be clear, civil, and businesslike, without any particular hostility that I recognized at the time as foreshadowing what would eventually happen with our deposit. I want to describe the actual mechanics of my move-out, because the specific timeline matters to understanding how the eventual dispute over the security deposit unfolded. I moved my belongings out over a single weekend, roughly 2 months before our lease's official end date, having found a new apartment I was eager to settle into. I left the shared common areas in reasonably clean condition, and my own bedroom, the space I'd occupied for 2 years, in condition consistent with normal wear rather than any significant damage. I didn't take exit photos of my own room specifically, a choice I've since regretted, though I want to be clear that my move-in photos from 2 years earlier would ultimately prove sufficient to establish the actual baseline condition of the apartment, regardless of my failure to document the exit process with the same thoroughness. I want to describe the email I received from our landlord, 3 days after officially vacating, because it represented the first indication I had that Ashley had constructed a narrative considerably more damaging than anything actually reflecting the apartment's true condition. The email, from our landlord, Mr. Hendricks, a man I'd interacted with only occasionally throughout our tenancy given that Ashley had typically served as our primary point of contact, informed me that my portion of our combined security deposit was being withheld in full, citing significant damage documented in a report Ashley had apparently submitted following my move-out. I want to describe my initial reaction to this email, because the specific disorientation of it mattered enormously to how I eventually processed and responded to the situation. I read through the itemized list of alleged damage: scuffed floors throughout my former bedroom, a cracked bathroom tile, carpet stains, several other issues I genuinely didn't recognize as reflecting the apartment I'd actually lived in for 2 years. I want to describe, in detail, exactly what Ashley had claimed, because the specificity of these fabricated claims matters to understanding how thoroughly they would eventually be contradicted by my move-in photos. Ashley's report described extensive floor scuffing throughout my former bedroom, damage she attributed to careless furniture moving during my 2 years of occupancy. She described a cracked bathroom tile, near the shower, that she claimed had resulted from something I'd dropped and never reported. She described carpet stains in my old room that she characterized as evidence of general uncleanliness throughout my tenancy. I want to be direct about my own confusion reading through these claims, because several of them described damage I simply didn't recognize as having existed in the apartment at any point during my actual occupancy. The bathroom tile, in particular, struck me as suspicious. I distinctly remembered that specific tile being intact throughout my entire 2 years living there, a detail I felt confident about even before I thought to check my original move-in photos for confirmation. I want to describe the specific moment I decided to check my original move-in photos, because it represented the beginning of my actual, evidence-based response to Ashley's fabricated claims. I opened my cloud storage, searching back through 2 years of photos until I located the folder I'd created on move-in day, 40-some photographs documenting every room of the apartment in careful, methodical detail, each one clearly timestamped with the actual date I'd taken them. I want to describe what these photos actually showed, because their specificity mattered enormously to how definitively they would eventually contradict Ashley's claims. The bathroom photos showed the same tile Ashley now claimed I'd cracked, fully intact, in a series of photos from multiple angles taken on our actual first day in the apartment. The bedroom floor photos showed a floor in good condition, without any of the extensive scuffing Ashley had described in her report to our landlord. I want to address, specifically, Ashley's claim about carpet stains in my former bedroom, because this particular accusation required slightly more nuanced investigation than the more straightforward bathroom tile discrepancy. My move-in photos did show the bedroom carpet in generally good, clean condition, without any staining visible in the initial documentation. I genuinely didn't recall any significant staining developing during my actual 2 years of occupancy, though I want to be honest that I couldn't rule out some minor, ordinary wear that might have developed gradually over 2 years of normal living, where I wouldn't necessarily have specifically documented myself before moving out. What I could establish clearly, however, was that whatever staining Ashley was now describing represented either exaggeration well beyond any reasonable characterization of normal wear, or damage that had occurred after my departure but before her own exit from the apartment, a distinction that would become directly relevant once I began reconstructing the actual timeline of the dispute. I want to describe the phone call I made to Mr. Hendricks directly, once I'd reviewed my photos thoroughly, because this call represented the first step in formally challenging Ashley's fabricated damage report. I received your email about the deposit withholding, I told him, and I want to dispute several of the specific claims. I have photos from our actual move-in day, 2 years ago, that directly contradict at least 2 of the items on Ashley's list. Mr. Hendricks, to his credit, seemed genuinely open to reviewing additional evidence rather than simply accepting Ashley's report as definitive. I'll be honest, he told me, Ashley's report was fairly detailed, and I didn't have any reason to question it at the time. But if you have documentation contradicting specific claims, I'm certainly willing to look at that before finalizing anything. I want to describe the process of formally submitting my move-in photos to Mr. Hendricks, because the specific, methodical nature of this submission mattered to how definitively it would eventually resolve the dispute. I organized the relevant photos carefully, focusing specifically on the bathroom tile and bedroom floor claims, since these represented the most objectively verifiable discrepancies between Ashley's report and the apartment's actual, documented condition on move-in day. I included the full metadata for each photo, clearly showing the 2-year-old timestamp that established these images as genuine, contemporaneous documentation rather than anything I might have fabricated after the fact. I sent these photos to Mr. Hendricks with a brief, factual cover message, avoiding any emotional language or direct accusation against Ashley, simply presenting the objective, timestamped evidence and asking him to review it against her claims. I want to describe Mr. Hendricks's response once he'd reviewed my photos, because his reaction mattered significantly to how quickly the dispute began moving toward genuine resolution. He called me directly, rather than responding by email, his tone carrying a specific, genuine concern that I hadn't fully anticipated. "These photos are pretty conclusive," he told me. "That bathroom tile is clearly intact in your move-in documentation. I'm going to need to have a more serious conversation with Ashley about the rest of her report, given this discrepancy." I appreciated his willingness to take the contradiction seriously rather than simply splitting the difference between competing claims, understanding, even in that moment, how much this specific response would matter to whether the situation could actually be resolved fairly. According to what Mr. Hendricks later shared with me, once he'd confronted Ashley directly with the contradicting photos, her explanation revealed a specific combination of financial motivation and poor judgment that, while not excusing her actions, at least provided some context for understanding why she'd constructed such a fabricated report in the first place. Ashley had apparently been facing her own financial pressures following our lease's end, needing funds for a security deposit on a new apartment she was moving into with Tyler. She'd calculated, apparently, that attributing additional damage to my portion of the tenancy might allow her to recover a larger share of our combined deposit for herself, at my direct expense. She admitted, eventually, that some of what she'd reported was exaggerated, Mr. Hendricks told me. She maintained that some legitimate where did exist, but she acknowledged, once pressed with your photos, that the bathroom tile claim specifically wasn't accurate, and that she'd been under real financial pressure when she filed the original report. I want to describe how Mr. Hendricks ultimately resolved the deposit dispute, once he'd gathered sufficient information from both Ashley and me to make a fair determination. He conducted what amounted to an informal investigation, reviewing my photos, Ashley's original claims, and, eventually, additional photos Ashley herself provided from her own more recent documentation, taken closer to our actual move-out rather than reflecting the apartment's original move-in condition 2 years earlier. Based on this fuller picture, Mr. Hendricks determined that the bathroom tile and floor scuffing claims were unsupported by evidence and couldn't be attributed to my tenancy specifically. He did find some legitimate, minor carpet wear that fell within the range of normal usage over 2 years, insufficient to justify significant deposit withholding but enough to warrant a modest, shared deduction rather than attributing the full cost entirely to either of us. I want to describe the specific relief of finally receiving my actual deposit, once this investigation had concluded, because the process, while ultimately successful, had required genuine effort and stress that I don't think should have been necessary given the actual, documented truth of what had happened. Mr. Hendricks returned the substantial majority of my original deposit, just over $900 of the original $1,100, with a modest deduction reflecting the legitimate, minor where he'd identified as a shared responsibility between both former tenants rather than damage I'd specifically caused. I want to be honest about the specific satisfaction of this resolution, understanding that without my original decision, 2 years earlier, to document the apartment's condition so thoroughly, I would have had no meaningful way to counter Ashley's fabricated claims, regardless of how untrue they actually were. I want to describe the conversation I eventually had with Ashley directly, once the deposit dispute had been formally resolved, because I felt it was important to address the situation with her personally rather than simply letting the landlord's resolution stand as the entire consequence of what she'd done. I called her, keeping my tone as measured as I could manage given the genuine anger I still felt about the situation. I want to understand why you did this, I told her. You fabricated damage claims, specifically the bathroom tile, that you had to know weren't accurate. That's not exaggerating normal wear. That's lying, specifically, to take money that wasn't yours to take. Ashley was quiet for a long moment before responding, her voice carrying a specific defensiveness I recognized from the tension that had developed between us over our final year of living together. I needed the money, she said. Tyler and I needed a bigger deposit for our new place, and I figured you probably wouldn't check closely enough to notice. I want to describe the rest of this conversation, because I think the specific quality of Ashley's eventual acknowledgement mattered to how I processed the entire situation afterward. I didn't think you'd actually have photos, she admitted, once I pressed her further. I thought it would just be my word against a general assessment, and landlords usually don't investigate that closely unless someone pushes back hard. I didn't expect you to have actual proof. That's not really an explanation for why you thought this was okay to do in the first place, I told her. Regardless of whether you thought you'd get caught, you decided to lie about specific damage, take money from me that I was entitled to, because you needed it and thought I wouldn't notice or wouldn't be able to prove otherwise. I know, she said, finally, her voice smaller now. I don't have a good excuse. I was stressed about money, and it felt like an easy solution at the time. I didn't really think through how it would actually affect you, specifically, or how wrong it was until Mr. Hendricks called me with your photos. I want to address directly why I chose not to pursue any further, more formal consequences against Ashley, beyond the deposit resolution itself, given that her actions arguably could have supported a stronger legal or financial claim on my part. I consulted briefly with a friend who'd gone through law school, mostly to understand what my actual options were, and learned that pursuing Ashley further, for the stress and effort of formally disputing her claims, for instance, was technically possible but would likely require more time, money, and emotional energy than I felt the situation ultimately warranted, given that the primary financial harm had already been corrected through Mr. Hendricks's investigation. I decided, instead, that the deposit resolution itself, combined with Ashley finally, directly acknowledging what she'd done, represented sufficient consequence for a situation I mostly wanted to simply put behind me and move forward from, rather than extending through additional conflict. I want to describe what this experience taught me, more broadly, about the importance of documentation in situations I never anticipated needing it for, because I think this lesson extends well beyond just this specific roommate dispute. I had taken those move-in photos 2 years earlier purely as a precautionary measure, following a friend's advice, without any specific expectation that I'd eventually need them to counter a former roommate's fabricated damage claims. The actual usefulness of that documentation, when it finally mattered, illustrated something I've since applied more broadly to other areas of my life: the specific value of establishing a clear, contemporaneous record of important situations, even when there's no immediate reason to suspect you'll need it. I've continued this practice in every subsequent living situation, documenting move-ins thoroughly regardless of how trustworthy a new roommate or landlord initially seems, understanding, from this direct experience, exactly how quickly a seemingly functional relationship can deteriorate into something requiring actual evidence to navigate fairly. I found myself, in the months since this happened, sharing a version of this story with several friends navigating their own roommate situations or preparing to move into new shared living arrangements. Document everything, from day one, regardless of how well you think you know the person you're moving in with, I tell them. I never anticipated needing those photos when I took them. Ashley and I were on genuinely good terms during our first year together. But relationships change, financial pressures arise, and having that contemporaneous record made all the difference in being able to counter a fabricated claim I never could have proven otherwise. I think about that advice often, turning it over for myself as much as for the friends I'm offering it to. The specific, unglamorous effort of spending 45 minutes photographing an apartment on move-in day felt, at the time, like unnecessary caution. It ended up being the exact evidence that definitively settled a serious, financially significant dispute 2 years later. My relationship with Ashley today is effectively non-existent. We haven't spoken since that final phone call where she acknowledged what she'd done, and I don't anticipate any future contact between us, given how thoroughly this situation damaged whatever functional relationship we'd once maintained. I don't regret this outcome. I think some relationships, once they've involved this kind of deliberate, financially motivated deception, aren't worth the effort of rebuilding, regardless of how amicable the earlier portions of the relationship might have been. I've made peace with simply moving forward, understanding that Ashley's choices, not mine, were what ultimately ended whatever roommate relationship we'd once had. If there's a lesson in this, it's one I carry with me now every time I move into a new living situation, camera in hand, documenting every wall and floor and fixture with the same careful thoroughness that once felt, to Ashley, like unnecessary paranoia. The actual truth of what an apartment looked like, on one specific day 2 years earlier, ended up mattering considerably more than any argument I could have made without that documentation. I don't think I took those photos imagining I'd eventually need them to counter a former roommate's fabricated damage claims. I think I simply followed good advice, at the time, without fully understanding how essential that advice would eventually prove to be. I don't know if Ashley fully understood, in the moment she decided to fabricate those claims, that a 2-year-old photo folder, sitting quietly in my cloud storage, would definitively contradict everything she was telling our landlord. But I know that the actual, timestamped truth, patient, documented, and finally submitted at the exact moment it mattered most, settled the matter completely, once given the proper chance to be seen. If you've ever been falsely blamed for damage or wrongdoing you never actually caused, I'd love to hear how you proved the truth, and what happened next. Let me know in the comments. And if this story meant something to you, consider subscribing. There are more stories like this one coming every week.